Are you looking for a mid-range phone that delivers flagship level camera performance? Today we're putting two exciting contenders head to head. The design-forward Nothing Phone 3A and the nostalgia-infused HMD Skyline. We're going to dive deep into the camera capabilities to help you decide which one deserves a spot in your pocket. First, let's get a baseline by going over the hardware specs. This will give us a starting point for what we would expect from each phone. Let's kick things off with the Nothing 3A. On the rear, its main sensor boasts a solid 50 megapixels with a 24mm equivalent focal length and an f1.9 aperture. Crucially, it's got both OIS and EIS for stabilization and the respectable 1/1.57-inch sensor. Moving to the telephoto, we're looking at another 50 megapixels, which translates to a 2x optical zoom at 50mm equivalent. It has an f2 aperture and relies on EIS only for stabilization, sitting on a 1/2.74-inch sensor. And for the ultra-wide, it's an 8 megapixel sensor, giving you a 0.6 optical zoom at 15mm equivalent. It has an f2.2 aperture and is also EIS only, with a 1/4-inch sensor. Up front, the Nothing Phone 3A packs a 32 megapixel camera with a 22mm equivalent, an f2.2 aperture, EIS only, and a 1/3.44-inch sensor. Now let's shift our focus over to the HMD Skyline. And again, we're starting with the rear sensors. The main sensor is a hefty 108 megapixels with an f1.8 aperture and both OIS and EIS. Its sensor size is 1/1.67. Actually very similar in physical size to Nothing Phone 3A's main sensor despite the huge megapixel difference. The telephoto sensor on the Skyline also comes in at 50 megapixels with 2x optical zoom, an f2 aperture, and EIS only on a 1/2.76-inch sensor. And lastly, the ultra-wide sensor comes in at 13 megapixels with 0.5x zoom, an f2.5 aperture, and EIS only, sitting on a 1/3-inch sensor. Finally, the front camera on the HMD Skyline boasts a high-res 50 megapixels with an f2.5 aperture and EIS only. So what are the main hardware differences to keep in mind? Firstly, the Nothing Phone 3A actually has a larger sensor than the HMD Skyline, even though it has a lower megapixel count. Conversely, the HMD Skyline's ultra-wide camera stands out with its larger sensor and higher megapixel count, giving it a clear spec advantage in that department. Alright, that's enough about the specs. Let's move on to the good stuff, the actual photo samples. We'll start with the bright outdoor scenes. Kicking things off with the ultra-wide from both phones. Immediately, the Nothing Phone 3A's HDR processing blends in better. It was also able to bring back the true blue of the sky, whereas the HMD still has somewhat overexposed look. Overall, I definitely prefer the Nothing 3A's warmer color science in this instance. If we crop in a little, we can start to see some major differences in processing, or possibly even lens quality. The HMD clearly exhibits some color fringing as we move towards the edges. It's noticeable even without cropping, but zooming in really highlights the issue. Moving to the main sensor, it looks to be much of the same story we saw with the ultra-wide. The HMD appears to be overexposing and losing information in the photo. The most apparent example of this is the roof of the building in the background. The right side of the overhang is completely missing in the HMD shot, but is clearly there in the photo from the Nothing 3A. Now let's look at the telephoto lenses. I had to give it to both phones here. There isn't a huge difference in the look between their three sensors. This consistency really helps keeping the photos uniform when switching from one lens to the other. For the differences between the two phones, the performance of these telephoto sensors is probably the closest in this comparison. I didn't see the HMD overexpose any part of the photo this time. I also noticed that the color fringing was reduced to the point of not being noticeable on the HMD's photo, which is a bit surprising that the telephoto sensor did the best in that regard. The Nothing 3A continues to perform great with no noticeable chromatic aberration on this lens either. When looking at the 4x photo, I actually see color fringing on the Nothing 3A and not on the HMD. So apparently the Nothing 3A can still suffer from this issue on some occasions. Next up is portrait mode, and this is where we see how well they separate the background from the subject and how good they produce a background blur. Starting with the main sensor, both phones did a great job with edge detection. Although to be fair, me wearing a cap likely made the job a lot easier for these phones. With the front camera, the HMD missed a couple of spots with the edge detection, while the Nothing 3A was a bit more accurate. The HMD's bokeh looks natural, with a soft blur style that I think makes it easier to be consistent. The Nothing 3A, however, has a lot of bokeh balls in the background, randomly spread throughout the tree limbs in this sample. It can be a bit distracting and looks somewhat unnatural. Funny enough, the bokeh on the HMD's main sensor was the one to produce too many bokeh balls. It almost looks like I'm standing in front of a Christmas tree in this sample photo. Focusing on the skin tones, I think the HMD has a more natural look. The Nothing 3A looks quite a bit warmer than natural, which I guess goes with their overall warmer tone. I also noticed that the HMD smooths out the face more, but then also sharpens the image more. So my face was smoother, but my facial hair was over sharpened. In this specific sense, the Nothing looks more natural. And lastly, with the portrait mode, I wanted to make a note about my experience while trying to take a selfie with the main sensor on the HMD. I actually struggled quite a bit to get a decent one. I don't think any of them actually were sharp and in focus, at least, for my face. And it was just a struggle to get a decent photo. On the contrary, the Nothing was super easy and basically got a perfect photo on the first try each time. And I understand that taking a selfie with the main sensor is not the best practice because you can't see what you're taking a photo of, but it takes the best photo, and I do it often with my other phones. The HMD was just a special situation in which it didn't want to capture me in focus. And now let's put these cameras to the test in challenging low light scenarios. These first two photos were taken in an extremely shaded area during the early part of a sunset. So there's a large range between the shadows and the highlights in the skies. The HMD once again blows out the highlights more than the Nothing 3A. Looking at the trees above the roof, there are additional branches present in the Nothing's photo, while the HMD Skyline lost them completely in the highlights. The HMD does manage darker blacks, which is present in the Tesla in these photos. I also noticed more detail when looking at the tree trunks in the HMD's main sensor, but then it switches to the Nothing showing more detail in the telephoto. Moving to the picture with the Bronco, the Nothing preserves a good amount more detail in the shadows than the HMD. Cropping into the tires, the Nothing 3A clearly shows the ridges all the way around the tire, whereas the HMD crushes the darker areas of the tires and loses all the details in certain spots. The color tone on the car is also significantly different in these two photos. They are drastically different, but I just don't know which one is closer to the real thing. Now, I did notice something odd with the telephoto sample of the Nothing 3A. The Bronco has vertical lines all across the body of the car that I hadn't noticed until I cropped in. They're not exactly subtle either. Any sort of cropping or viewing on a larger screen will likely make them easily noticeable. Moving to the ultra-wide low light sample, the sky on the HMD immediately caught my attention. There is so much color fringing that it actually changes the look of the sky. This next section is going to introduce the darkest photos that I have, with only a slight bit of light in the background and no other fill light available. The Nothing 3A seems to struggle with focusing in ultra low light. I was not able to get a photo using night mode only where the subject was in focus. This alone makes the HMD outperform the Nothing here. Next, let's look at using flash. The Nothing's flash might be a bit brighter, or the phone does not compensate for the added light enough, but it looks a bit hot. The HMD looks better exposed and preserves more of the orange background color. However, this seems to have come in handy with the flash using the 2x lens. The Nothing looks better exposed now, while the HMD looks a bit washed out or dim. Now for the Nothing Phone 3A, we have an additional scenario to test, and that's using the glyph lights. This gives us another option for lighting the subject. The glyph lights get the Nothing's main sensor photo looking much closer to the HMD's main sensor, although it adds a slightly green tint to the subject. The benefit is that the light is softer, so there is less strong shadows in the subject. Let's transition now to video performance. When comparing the video output from these two phones, I specifically focused on videos with movement, because most modern phones are going to take great video if you're on a tripod or holding it standing still. Basically anything with little to no movement is going to produce a great video, and I'm testing the stabilization on this. And also we're going to be able to see the same results, just maybe with added jitteriness or movement on this type of test. So it's kind of like an all-in-one test either way. These phones have the following in common. Both exhibit a lot of jitter despite having OIS on the main sensor, and as expected, moving to the 2x sensor, the jitter gets even worse. Here's what differs. The HMD blows out the highlights in the videos as well, while the Nothing 3A has better HDR. The HMD Skyline has a noticeable choppier video, whereas the Nothing is smoother when comparing side by side, even though both were shot at 4K 30. They both also have slow motion, but the only way to truly use it effectively is standing still or on a tripod. The stabilization is either not there or struggling, and there's plenty of wobble in the videos with each step. But the 1080p output for the slow motion looks decent and can get the job done. In my opinion, the HMD's slow motion videos are better for the following reasons. They're cleaner with less noise, Nothing tends to crush the shadows while HMD keeps them visible, and the HMD has steadier footage. Moving to the lower light video, a lot of what was just pointed out will continue to get worse. The colors on both phones remain similar to brighter scenes. The jitter gets worse, although HMD's degradation is much more noticeable than Nothing's. Interestingly, the sharpness between both phones evens out a bit in lower light. The 2x sensor amplifies all these weak points in both phones, but critically, both will look good on steady positions. The stabilization is truly the big weakness for these two phones in low light scenes. And finally, looking at video with the built-in flash or glyph lights. The flash helps keep the jitter to a minimum. Since the subject is well lit, the phone is able to provide good quality video on both phones. The Nothing gets the same advantage of a softer light on the subject because of the glyphs, but it also has the option for the flash to provide stronger lighting if necessary. All in all, both the HMD and Nothing can provide good video in a studio setting where the subject is well lit and everything else is very dark. All I already noticed on the footage from these phones is that there is some noise in the darker areas, but that's to be expected in these types of scenes, and the noise is very clean and minimal. One important thing for vloggers that like to use the front-facing camera is that the HMD is the only one of the two that can shoot in 4K, and the Nothing is limited to 1080p. So the big question is, which phone performs better? For the majority of the tests, the Nothing Phone 3a performed better consistently. The biggest win for the HMD in this test is that it has higher quality front-facing camera video. So if your thing is taking video with a front-facing camera, the HMD will be the one that performs best for you. But in pretty much all other scenarios, it's gotta be the Nothing Phone 3a. Let me know which phone you think won this comparison. Type Nothing or HMD in the comments to let me know your pick. Alright, I'll see you in the next one.